Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to Equity Can't Be an Add-on, a conversation about design, waste, and justice. I'm Mona Chun with Mebel Transforming Furniture, where we are championing a future of furniture that is sustainable and circular as a hub for educational resources, content, and cross-sector collaboration. Mebel has produced ReDesign Week, a new track of Refashion Week NYC, to explore creative solutions to our massive furniture and design waste problem. We'd like to thank the organizers of Refashion Week NYC, the Sanitation Foundation, and Donate NYC, who are committed to bringing New Yorkers together to pursue a zero waste vision in which style and sustainability go hand in hand. For the first of the 3 redesign webinars, I'm honored to be joined by 3 incredible women who will help us start to unpack the intersections of design, waste, and equity, and how we might each be part of the change towards a more just and sustainable future. Jacqueline Patterson is the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership, which is rooted in a just transition framework, serving as a vehicle to connect Black communities on the front lines of climate justice with the resources to actualize visions. Jackie has also served as senior director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program for over a decade. Jennifer Graham is a principal corporate interiors at the global firm Perkins Will. She co-founded the networking and peer mentoring organization LMNOP, Leadership Mentoring, Networking, and Opportunity for Architecture and Design Professionals. And following LMNOP's acquisition by the International Interior Design Association, IIDA New York chapter, she currently serves as IIDA New York's Vice President of Action. Hi. And Shawnasia Black is the lead interior designer at Urban Architectural Initiative, which specializes in developing supportive and affordable housing in New York City. She is also the founder and principal designer of Asia B Designs, a studio focused on residential design. And Shawnasia is currently Equity Council co-chair for IIDA New York. Welcome, Jackie, Jennifer, and Shawnasia. You can read more about them in their bios linked in the chat. If I was going to share all of their accomplishments, we'd be here all day listening to that. So please take a look at their bios in the chat. So I wanted to start the conversation today with Jackie. The title of this event, Equity Can't Be an Add-on, is a quote from you in a Metropolis magazine article from January 2020. You stated, "There needs to be a movement towards universalizing access to start with folks who need it most. Equity can't be an add-on, it actually needs to be foundational." Tell us more about what you mean by that, and especially as it relates to design and waste.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Yeah, so when I said that, part of it was seeing that multiple well-intended efforts are out there to try to integrate equity. So whether it is, I've been in conversation with the International Living Futures Institute about the fact that with their building standards, the equity is a petal in the flower, and what I can't think of a good analogy in terms of like the stem or whatever the thing in the center is. Anyway, so I feel like it needs to, that I was speaking with them and saying specifically that it needs to be more than a petal, that it needs to be a through line throughout the flower. And so similarly in other areas, you'll see where there is kind of a designated space for equity, as opposed to actually seeing that equity needs to be throughout. And so specifically, specifically how that ends up showing up. We see the situations where it's the communities that are, as it relates to design and waste and so forth, the communities that are on the front lines of how waste is disposed of and not handled well, including incinerators and landfills, that it is frontline communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, low-income communities that end up being host to these harmful facilities. So whether it is landfills that end, where the waste ends up leaking into the water aquifer, as we saw in Jackson, Tennessee, including in polluting the water supply with trichloroethylene for communities there, or we see where incinerators are, waste incinerators are, yes, in some cases creating energy, but while so doing, they are also emitting mercury, arsenic, lead, and benzene, which is a known carcinogen as well. And so when we think about what ends up in our waste systems, then we see, oops, sorry, then we start to see how it's frontline communities that suffer from those impacts. So when we think about infusing equity into our systems, we have to think about from beginning to end how we're integrating equity. So when we think about materials production, who's on the production line, what is the production process looking like, what types of toxins are people exposed to at that time, depending on what materials we're using to build, who is actually profiting from the manufacturing industry, the design industry, and so forth, and who are the people who are receiving access to resources in that industry. And so we talk about environmental justice, it's defined by the unequal distribution of the benefits and burdens. And so we need to make sure that we are eliminating the burdens so that no one is experiencing the burdens, and that we are making sure that we're infusing equity so that everyone experiences the benefits. And so as we not only think about what's going into materials that we're designing, but also thinking about who's doing it. And then as we think about the durability of these materials, so that whatever it's designed with, that it doesn't end up so quickly, as it's so many of the disposable items that we develop end up so quickly into landfills or incinerators and so forth. So so we have to think from beginning to end of those aspects. So I'll just kind of stop there, but that just gives you a little bit of a sense of what I mean when I see equity can't be an add-on that needs to be thought of from beginning to end.
Great, that's a helpful framing. And how does the work you're doing with the Chisholm Legacy Project relate to the intersection we're talking about today?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start with the work that I founded at the NAACP called the Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector Initiative. And in that, it was all about how do we ensure that we have, and we continue to support that work with the Chisholm Legacy Project. And in founding that initiative, it was actually seeing that the great sisters on this panel, Jennifer and Shawnasia, are these amazing leaders. They are, and because of their own brilliance and their own vision and their creativity and innovation, and that too often there aren't those opportunities, and they're actually bridging that gap actively. And so when we were starting to do this work, we saw that there was a gap in terms of who was engaging in conversations around architecture, around interior design, around buildings, and what building standards should look like. And so our work is always about bridging that gap and ensuring access. And so at the Chisholm Legacy Project, the Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector continues under the stewardship of the NAACP and the Emerald Cities Collaborative, and we are contributing there. And we've actually put together a training and certification program on the principles and practices and policies of the Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector Initiative, to help folks to kind of see that how we design our spaces where we live, work, pray, and play is something that we should all be thinking about in terms of what is our role there? How do we make sure that there is equity there? And so by doing that training program, we help folks to kind of not only see their place in it, but also see their avenues for actually having impact. So thank you.
Yeah. And can you tell us the name of that initiative again? Centering Equity in
Yes,
building.
Yes, it's centering equity. It's both a mission statement and a title all in one. But it's called Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector Initiative. Yeah, and it's overarching around the built environment. But
Fantastic. And Shawnasia, I wanted to ask you, like the Chisholm Legacy Project, the IIDA's Equity Council is focused on a just and equitable future with a more representative, diverse, inclusive, or as the Chisholm Legacy Project says, the frontline leadership. Tell us about the work of the Equity Council and how its vision applies to what we're talking about today.
Thank you. So I think the work that Equity Council is trying to do is just, in my eyes, level the playing field, if that makes any sense. The conversations that we've been having in our projects. So sorry, I'm just hearing the feedback, so I'll take out one of my headphones. Can you still hear me correctly?
Yes.
Okay, great. So basically our tagline is becoming the DE&I resource for the A&D industry. So we've been having hard conversations about just everything that you wouldn't really think impacts the A&D industry. Most recently, we had a conversation about colorism. And that conversation was enlightening to everybody who was on that dialogue, because it opened up their mind frame about, I didn't think that this was something that impacted the interior design industry, and you wouldn't think it would, but it actually does, in conversations like that. For me, my own personal agenda, being a part of Equity Council, I would love to get kind of into the young minds, even younger than high school, elementary school, middle school, if you will, to let them know that this creative world exists, right? I think if someone had taught me a little bit about what interior design was outside of HGTV, my path to being an interior designer would be a lot cheaper and a lot more straight and narrow. So that's been my passion project with Equity Council. We have a website where you can definitely find out more about our work and our initiatives, and we can share that at the end of or drop it in the chat, if you will. But yeah, it's just about leveling the playing field. And to me, that means having the hard conversations that no one really wants to do, and then apply actions to those conversations.
Yeah, I think we'll put that in the chat. The Equity Council has done something called the Equity Pledge. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so it's basically an assessment tool that we are tasking firms and architectural firms to sign and take on. It's, I'll say, a lengthy pledge, but really just allow for these firms to really shine a flashlight on what they call DE&I, JEDI, all the letters that have come after that. And it's really taking to task these firms to how they can level the playing field. So we're still working out exactly how that looks. We have a couple of pledge signers. I think we had 4, maybe 5, if I remember. So right now we're working with how do we connect with them, make sure that they understand the pledge, make sure that they are doing the work, if you will, because this is hard work and it's not easy, and no one really understands what equity means. I think equity right now is very a new term, almost like sustainability was new, and no one knew what that meant and how that looked. So equity right now is kind of taking on that form for me. So it has many different meanings and many different conversations and many different routes and paths to get to this equity and inclusion. So we're just doing our best and trying to
That's great.
bring everybody to the table.
Right. And you said that it's focused on the A&D community, architecture and design.
Yes.
And anyone can sign that pledge? You have to be
To my
members
understanding, we're targeting firms. So it's not an individual task, although we do welcome everybody to read the pledge, and then that way they can kind of help us infiltrate their firms and their companies. But it's not an individual pledge that you want to take. If you want to emotionally sign it, please do.
Okay, and I think you're right that we're learning new terms, and you mentioned colorism. Can you tell us, for the folks who haven't heard that term, what that means?
Yes. So I won't say that it plagues only the African American industry.
People.
It won't plague, yes, people. Thank you. Because actually on that call, I learned that it's plagues a lot of other people of color. So basically you get treated better or worse based on your complexion, right? I know from my own personal experience, I'm a woman of a darker shade of tone. So compared to, not to spotlight you, but compared to Jennifer, I may be treated worse than her or not get certain liberties or so on and so forth. There was actually at one time this thing called the paper brown bag test, where if you were darker than a paper bag, you would get denied certain access to institutions, organizations, and then so on and so forth. And actually in that conversation that we had with Equity Council, it was one of our lunchtime series, I had heard that there were conversations, this woman, she was Southeast Asian, talking about how her family, her aunties were talking about bleaching her skin to lighten her skin tone, to be more fair and more Eurocentric looking, and because that's the standard of beauty, not my standard of beauty, but so yes, essentially that's a broad definition of colorism. Did I say that? I explained that right, ladies, right? Jackie? Okay.
Yep, that's helpful. And I'd say even in Asian communities that exists as well, for sure. Jennifer, I'd love to ask you a question about the IIDA New York chapter as well. You're the VP of Action, and you're engaged with 3 initiatives that touch on our topic: the Catalyst Committee, the Equity Council, and the Sustainability Circle. Can you tell us a bit about these entities and how they relate to today's topic, and whether or how they interact with each other?
Certainly. Well, I'll also add by saying that on my professional side, Perkins and Will, I'm also head of the Social Purpose Initiative, which is, to me, equitable with Catalyst. I'm involved as a principal in the JEDI initiative, which of course is completely aligned with equity. And I'm also have participated avidly and support our Living Design initiative, which aligns with the Sustainability Circle. So for me, being IIDA creating a position for someone like myself in this organization has really, they really understand not just where my passion is, but where I've tried to align myself professionally so that I can help bridge a gap between what professional organizations have to offer and what international organizations like IIDA have to offer. And I'm just very fortunate to be in a position in a firm that believes that those 3 are integral, not only to design, but how we conduct ourselves as professionals. So that kind of gives an overview. The position was created for me to oversee these 3 entities because I do believe, and along with firms' ESG policies, you can't have one without another. You can't have equity without purpose. You can't have purpose without sustainability in living and human-centric design. I'm co-chair of Catalyst, and however, I oversee equity and the sustainability circle. So I'm an advisors to equity and sustainability circle, but I'm actually a co-chair of Catalyst. And our objective is to bring our professional expertise to communities and nonprofits who normally would not have access to this expertise. So that's really the focus of, and really how at this point of my career that I've been fortunate to have those elements come together. And I do think they're very important when it comes to all of the topics that are being highlighted today, whether it is through policy, whether it is through a circular economy, which we all must start investing in and paying more attention to. I remember growing up, we used to talk about cradle to grave, and we can't think of that anymore. It really needs to be cradle to cradle. And, you know, Jackie and Shawnasia are, you know, and many people are nodding your head. If we don't think of how we can deconstruct instead of destroying and filling landfills, we will not do justice to not only the earth, but to every single human being that we interact with and who interact with others. And from an equity standpoint, we cannot think that we can discard, discriminate, and not take into consideration waste that is landing on the doorstep of those who have no voice, and think it's not going to ultimately affect those who have the voice and need to be doing something different. So I think that kind of bundles, I hope.
Yeah. Someone asked in the Q&A or in the chat if you could explain what the JEDI initiative is. What does JEDI stand for those who haven't heard?
Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the reason my take on this, and Shawnasia and I go back a while, the take on the words justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, many of us have grouped them together because they support each other, and they also help to explain the definition that it is not skin deep, quote unquote. It is not about skin color. It's not only about equity. It's about economy. It's about access to living a sustainable and meaningful life. If you take any of those options away from any individual, they are not able to live their most purposeful and their most impactful lives. And as an economy, we lose out on potential, on human potential, by removing that access. So JEDI is an acronym. You know, it started with diversity inclusion, and then people added equity, and then people added justice, because you really, in my mind, must consider socio-political, human-centric art interaction. You really have to think of all of those terms as it relates to the acronym, and also all of those definitions. And it is difficult to use one definition for each word. They work with each other.
Thank you. And you also mentioned cradle to grave. We're sharing a lot of terms that some might not have heard of. So maybe Jennifer, you could share, or Jackie, we've also discussed this too, cradle to grave versus cradle to cradle.
I'm going to let Jackie take that one because she has such a deep connection with community and policy.
Thank you. Well, I was actually going to say the opposite because you framed cradle to cradle so beautifully, but maybe we can both take a little. But the idea, I mean, as really Jennifer introduced with that term of cradle to cradle, is that we have to move towards being a regenerative economy, really in a regenerative society, recognizing that that there is no away. When we talk about throwing something away, that everything is a part of our nothing. There's no place for things to go. Like everything is part of our ecosystem, and so we have to start thinking in that way in terms of how we manufacture, how we use, how we reuse, how we repurpose anything that is that we've created or pre-creation as we think about creating. And we have to create with that in mind, the notion that all things are will continue on, and that we have to frame our economy, frame our financial, well, I say our economy, I mean the goods, the services, and the production in our economy after this notion of kind of as we say, of durability, of recognizing that the ecosystem is designed to be regenerative in terms of the sun rising every day, the wind blowing, and how we whether it's how we generate energy, the millennium old seeds that we have in terms of how we generate food. And similarly, we need to be thinking about this way in terms of how we create furniture or any other goods that we use. And so that's where this kind of concept of cradle to cradle versus cradle to grave, because there is no grave per se, because it's all still part of our ecosystem. But Jennifer, I'm sure we'll
well, if we just take that macro concept and bring it really close to home, our society is a throwaway society, and we've talked about the impact of how throwing away on others' doorsteps ultimately affect everyone. Say it's like boats in the tide. One boat rises with the tide, all boats rise. But eventually, if the boats are sinking, every single boat will sink. So when you think about furniture, because that's where we started this conversation, and the 12 million tons that goes into almost all of it going into landfill each year, much of that has been supported by this throwaway economy. And there is conversation is carbon equity negatively impacted by furniture more than any other product? Because the impact on carbon neutrality is impacted by furniture, not only just the production, but also how it is discarded. And we're buying things and putting them in our homes, knowing that when we move to another place, you're just tossing everything to the curb, is an extremely destructive way to think of how to conduct our personal lives. I mean, now IKEA is starting to pay attention, and they're starting to create programs where they're renting furniture, or you can repair furniture. It's almost going back to quote unquote the way things were, before modern time, where you used to recycle everything and reuse everything until literally it could not be repurposed anymore. But the challenge is, because of modern technology, the items that we are reusing and repurposing are not going naturally back into the earth. They are creating destructive waste. So we've gone from being individuals who were stewards of our earth to being the ultimate consumers and destroyers of our earth. So we have to think of every single thing we do, buy, use every day. How can we think of its end life not being an end life, but it being part of a regenerative cradle to cradle, where you're supporting your community? And that's just furniture. It's really everything. Water, there's no element that we use for modern day that at this point in majority doesn't go towards a non-sustainable society. So we have all of these resources. We have the internet. We have organizations like the Legacy Project, IIDA. We have companies like my own Perkins Will and others around the country and globe that are trying to move the needle and participate with the larger legislative or organizations such as USGBC and others to try to make change that becomes legislation, because we haven't figured out how to do it on our own. So I've kind of gone to a very broad definition there or description there, but it's hard not to be micro and it's hard not to be broad. Every individual thing we use impacts all the way to us being told how we need to behave to lessen that impact.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there have been there were questions submitted by attendees about actions that that each individual can take, and it's so broad. We could take many different types of actions, from like buying a new cushion for our sofa to getting involved in legislation. But Shawnasia, I wanted to ask you a question about this as well. What systemic or structural changes do you think would help ensure we're putting equity and justice at the forefront whenever we talk about sustainable design? From furniture to interior design, architecture, buildings, and all the waste these fields create.
I really think it's about diversifying the opinions and personalities that are involved in these conversations. As I'm listening to Jennifer talk about, throwing away furniture, the Caribbean in me is like, what do you mean throwing away furniture? We throw away furniture? What are you talking about? Because growing up, that was not really something that we did, especially if it's like good furniture, good wood, which according to my mother, they don't make anymore. So I personally, growing up, have had this conversation in my head about like reuse, recycle, just on a micro level, right? And I feel like because I'm seeing some nodding of heads, if the people who are at the table having these conversations are more broad and represent globally what the United States represents, I think we would have better systems in place, or small ways to make these changes that need to be had. There's also little initiatives, I don't want to call it little, but Stoop NYC. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. That's always fun for me. And I think even little ways like that are just trying to promote some type of sustainability, right? So I really do think it's about diversifying the people who are involved in these conversations from the top down.
That's right. We also have a few questions about legislation, and Jennifer mentioned this as well. But a couple of questions that have come in ask about whether there are ordinances, state or federal laws and regulations that govern this problem from a solutions-based remedy. And that came in from Jane. And Amy Ruth has asked, are there any current advocacy projects that we should know about, and specifically how individuals or her students can get involved?
Well, I'll just highlight a specific law that was passed in New York City in August of 2018, and it's the Waste Equity Law. And one thing anyone can do is, about any of these topics you're interested in, we have fantastic resources in the internet, but every local jurisdiction, whether it's New York or others, have some sort of either initiatives or institutions that are trying to pass laws to make waste disposal more equitable, or they have put laws into place, just like local law 152 in New York City. So I would say it is beneficial to just Google and see what things are being done on a state and local front, and then look to other jurisdictions that are leaders. Like California has been a leader on many of the sustainability fronts and laws, but look to see what other states are doing or what other states are trying to do. And then, of course, just in terms of equity, there are quite a few, whether they're not local or national, institutions that are employing appropriate waste measures into their own corporate tenets by ESG. So that's environmental, social, and governance, incorporating those tenets into the way they do business, or at least trying to engage in local communities or in their own community on how they can move the needle, or nationally or internationally. But I would say, look to see what your local communities are doing, and look to see what institutions that support this are doing, and get involved or volunteer.
Great. Volunteer, get involved in some of these issues. That sounds very important. And Shawnasia, you mentioned how we can have more initiatives like Buy Nothing, or groups that help us get furniture off the curb. And there are a couple of questions about this too. Is there a way to scale up something like the Buy Nothing movement, so more furniture is given away rather than discarded? Can we incentivize this sort of reusing and recycling? What are things we could do, either Shawnasia, Jennifer, or Jackie, if you have suggestions?
I'll take that first leg of the conversation. I think getting involved on a local scale, as Jennifer mentioned, I know in my own community in the Bronx, we're starting to have conversations about like a repurposing center, if you will. There'd be a small area on the neighborhood that if someone has clothes or something, they can drop that off. I've seen that also kind of done on the with the food fridges. I've seen that a lot in Washington Heights, particularly. Working on getting that in my neighborhood too as well. But I think just doing the research, seeing if there's any initiatives going on in your neighborhood. I know also getting involved with churches in your neighborhood. They are big on either taking furniture or, well, I won't speak for all the churches, but I know I have some particularly who have helped me move my own personal furniture. So it's really just about getting involved and tapping into your local neighborhood, and seeing what initiatives are already happening there in your own backyard or front yard.
Yeah, I put a few things in the chat. One is the new waste equity law, the Environmental Justice Alliance, and that's only one of many organizations. And of course, the Chisholm Legacy Project, there's plenty of amazing information right there. And then one of the types of local organizations that Shawnasia was sharing, the one I've used is Free Cycle. Really, I mean, you can participate locally, whether there's a food pantry, whether, to your point, churches. There are so many ways you can give back within the community without really making any effort, and it makes it easy for yourself. Consignment, Housing Works, there's so many organizations. But I would say that on a professional level, if you're in school, pretty much all schools, and I happen to be sitting at New York School of Interior Design, and I know they have a connection to mobile, but your schools also are a resource. If you want to participate in any of these initiatives, you can literally find one that speaks to you. Once you're in the profession, you can join organizations, whether it's IIDA or AIA or any other organization, USGBC, join and volunteer, because literally the more you give to your community, the more they will give back to you. That's personal experience. And then on your personal side, outside of school or work, if you're involved in, whether it's your synagogue, your church, whatever, the YMCA, whatever it is, there are so many opportunities, even when it comes to just food sharing or, equitable and sustainable agriculture. There is so much on your local website and in your communities on ways you can participate. And quite frankly, the more you participate, the more you learn, the more you get to engage with others. And it actually, I hope for most, it brings back to this more meaningful life. If you can contribute to your community, you just end up having a more meaningful existence. And if you don't, if you have a passion about something in your professional life, find a firm and tell them why you're so passionate about them. I can't imagine they wouldn't want to hire you. So, and it maybe it's the wrong time, maybe you need more experience, but I'm telling you, I mean, my path to where I am now took a long time, but I knew this is where I wanted to be because in my view, it's a firm that believes in these principles. And I would say that if you have the opportunity to take that action, seek out the firms, seek out your network, become parts of organizations, because then you'll meet people in those firms. And if you're really passionate about it, you get to learn about it in a very easy way by being around others who believe what you're doing is meaningful for the community we live in. So I think that's my big, encompass on what you can do, because there's so much that we have access to, that we are fortunate to have at our fingers. The hardest thing is trying to discern where you can really take a path without getting fragmented.
Really quickly, I wanted to add on, because Jennifer mentioning being at NYSID right now currently. I remember as a student at FIT, I lived in our materials library. And now on the professional side, I've been trying to find ways to give back to universities, remembering being a student and having access to materials. So the website I just put in the chat is called Save a Sample. I've been using that organization prior to the pandemic. I have to pick that conversation back up again. But any samples that we no longer use in our materials library, I've been donating to them, and they've been distributing them to universities and schools that they see fit. So if anybody here on the panel is trying to figure out ways on the professional side to also give back and get into the conversation of sustainability, that's a very good resource to use.
Great, thanks. And I'll add that when I first spoke to Jennifer about joining the panel, she emphasized mentorship and including she calls it a younger generation, and asked to include Shawnasia on the panel, and it's wonderful to expand the community and be a great mentor as well to others who are interested in this work. I'm going to switch gears for a different question that has come in. What are the harms? Aisha asks, what are the harms and benefits of green capitalism to BIPOC communities? Would one of you like to take that question? Harms and benefits of green capitalism to BIPOC communities?
I don't know that term used in that way. So can you give us a little bit more context? Because I'm sure we all probably have quite a bit to say about it. You could go in many directions there.
Aisha can explain in the chat a bit more, but I think Aisha's talking about how the green economy has grown, and it is maybe has some limitations, as long as its benefits, and how it may be playing into as you stated, the benefits and burdens on BIPOC communities.
So is it how we are using measures, performance measures like LEED or certification entities to the benefit of those who have income over those who don't have as much access to?
Well,
I'm not sure, I'm
Aisha,
just not sure what,
Yeah.
what.
Aisha just responded.
Okay.
Green capitalism, as in the sustainability movement, allowing for new kinds of profit, like
Oh.
vegan products or clean energy being pushed out by oil companies.
Oh, okay. And I can't believe I hadn't quite heard that term used in this way, but it to me, it just points to incredible innovation that will happen over the next decade, because we're opening, I mean, we've seen a lot of development around products that are not being made with non-sustainable materials, or materials that we would say at Perkins and Will on a red list. You know, so if things are being fabricated so that when they go through the cycle to cradle to cradle circular economy process, and they're giving back as opposed to draining resources, I think there's a lot that is at the really not even near the peak of development at this point. So it will grow up, it will grow opportunities for those who have access to knowing it exists. If diverse people have access to that learning and knowledge when they're in school, and therefore are trained and are able to take on those jobs as they become available, or grants to develop new products. I think it's just a matter of, as Shawnasia was saying, is leveling the playing field and allowing and providing for equal access to opportunities, but also equal access for people to be able to create and participate in this green economy.
Yes, so 100% on that. And I think that the person was also asking about some of the challenges around green capitalism. And I think that one of them is that people will, you know, given our kind of tendencies towards, as a society, towards kind of rampant consumerism, then people will say, oh, I can kind of replace my buying of all of this stuff, my rampant and excessive buying of all of this stuff, with now I can actually do it in good conscience in terms of buying and having rampantly consuming all of this stuff because it's green. And so I think that's one of the places where we might see some challenges. And as a person said, in terms of the oil companies now going into clean energy, that one of the things that I talked about in terms of like not putting the new wine and the old wine skins of kind of this capitalist economy, and the way that it's a predator economy, an extractive economy. And so we've seen where oil companies have engaged in extractive processes, not just in terms of the actual extraction of the oil, but extraction in terms of our communities. And if they do that same thing with clean energy, whether it's putting in windmills in a community without engaging properly with the community around it, putting in solar panels in a community without making sure that the communities, as you say, have equal access, as Jennifer said, have equal access to these. So we've seen where this is already starting to happen, where when you just kind of replace a green technology into a capitalist economy. So those are some of the places where we also see some things that where we need to make sure there's guardrails around. So.
Right, that makes sense. Community engagement and equal access are important parts of that.
And purposeful approaches, because if you're not purposeful and intentional, you can go to extravagance or inequity. And I think that maybe circling back to, you know, this green capitalism, I mean, you can understand it on the concept of how it came about in terms of LEED and in terms of energy consumption, et cetera. But you don't just get LEED just because you want a trophy. You have to actually want to implement it because it's good for a larger purpose. And I think that's the piece I was trying to connect between the two before. It's like there is no point in having meaningful green economies if they are not giving back to the economy. And so that the economy to not only grow and flourish, but reduce waste. Just because you can afford it doesn't mean you should buy it.
Absolutely. I'd like to ask each of you a final question. If you could, maybe in 1 minute each, what are ways that our attendees today can get involved, such as signing the Equity Pledge, or other initiatives? What's one thing that everyone can do, or for those who are so inclined, a more in-depth opportunity for action? If you could each share one thing.
Integrate sustainability into your professional practice, whatever that is, and include purposeful and intentional action along with human-centric approaches, because it's hard to do one without the other. And it really is, make it part of the way you conduct your professional practice and life.
Thank you, Jennifer. Shawnasia?
I think on a personal level, educate yourself. I think, for example, the green capitalism term that came on, it was way over my head, and I felt almost a little intimidated that I'm on this panel and didn't know what that meant. But as I stated before, both sustainability and equity are two broad terms that mean a lot of things to a lot of different people at one time. So if you just take the time to educate yourself on all these initiatives, we've dropped a lot of resources in this chat alone. That would be one way, both I guess personal and on a professional level. Selfishly, I'm going to do a plug. Equity Council is on Instagram. We have a lunchtime series coming up April 20th. That's free to attend. Follow us on the gram, and you can join on our conversations, because I really do think it really does start with just opening and up, having these hard conversations and educating ourselves on it, both the professional and the individual level.
Thank you, Shawnasia. And Jackie?
Yeah, so I just was writing to put in the chat, and I'll do that here, is that I've been sharing some of the offerings in the chat with Cara, who's our resource hub manager for the Chisholm Legacy Project. And if anyone has resources to share with her that can reach our constituency, that would be great. Meanwhile, I've also been connecting. I've set up an email to introduce both Jennifer and Shawnasia to the Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector manager, and I would definitely invite all of you to think about connecting with CESBS in terms of a community of sharing around built environment, around products and goods, and how to really shift us to being a sustainable society and economy. So that is a great community of practice. So I would just highlight that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jackie. And we will, after this call, share all the resources from the chat with you in an email. You'll be getting that. And as we go forward with these actions for change, I have one closing story. The first time I spoke to Shawnasia, we were unexpectedly interrupted by her doorbell. And for me, it had been like an incredibly hectic day leading up to that call. But when she walked away from her video, I saw a sign above her entryway that said gratitude. And I put all my busyness aside for a meditative moment and reminded myself all that I had to be grateful for. And so Shawnasia gave me a wonderful gift that day, and just as you all have today. So my deep gratitude to Jackie and Jennifer and Shawnasia for your inspiration and leadership, and for sharing your time, wisdom, and work with us. Thank you. I have just a few announcements to close. If you want to hear more from inspiring leaders and change makers, we have 2 more webinars coming up this week, tomorrow and Thursday. One of them actually, we talked about a little bit today. It's called Alternatives to the Curb, How Real New Yorkers Redecorate and Keep Furniture Out of Landfills. So there will be many resources shared on how to do that on that webinar. And we have another 3 webinars on furniture, sustainability, and circularity during Circular City Week, which begins May 2nd. You can click on the link in the chat for details. We're also excited to be announcing the release of a circular design glossary for furniture and furnishings in the coming weeks. There's also a link in the chat for a sneak peek and to be notified when it's ready. Please fill out the feedback form to help us always improve our programming. And last but not least, thanks to the Refashion Week crew at the Sanitation Foundation and Donate NYC for hosting the week, and Mackenzie Pitt and August Rust on the Mebel team for your behind the scenes support. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, Jackie, Shawnasia, and Jennifer. I appreciate you.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye.